Welcome to the Cloud Native Testing Podcast. I'm Ole Lensmar, your host, and I've spent years building testing tools like SoapUI and Swagger, and now I'm the CTO at TestCube, where we're redefining testing for the cloud native landscape. In this podcast, we invite people in this space to discuss with us the challenges, solutions, and best practices for testing in Kubernetes and beyond, covering automation, CI/CD, GitOps, and more. This podcast is proudly sponsored by TestCube. If you're interested about how to test cloud-native applications and infrastructure, subscribe and stay tuned. Now let's dive into the episode. Thank you for joining. Hello and welcome to today's episode. I'm super happy to be joined by Joe Karp, who is a DevOps Architect at UWM. Joe, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm ready, and I'm excited to talk about the questions that you have for us today.
I mean, the topic of the podcast is cloud native testing, and I'm guessing you're involved with that, or I'm hoping at least, so kind of a fruitful discussion. Please, what's your take and kind of where are you in that journey?
Yeah, so for me, being my particular position, I think most people recognize it probably as a platform architect. Like I live in the middle, usually between the two sides at most places that are traditional. Like you have your operations teams and you have your app dev teams, and I live in that space in the middle. So I have to think about testing not only from a infrastructure perspective, I have to think about it in the application dev perspective, which is normally the place most people live when they come to look for testing. You're not going to find an operations guy really thinking through how do I test this change I'm about to push out. So like even when I have to build my own tooling, it's like how do we test this thing? Because like a lot of the tooling out there isn't really geared towards infrastructure testing. So you have to kind of come up with fun new ways of doing that. You get into the realms of chaos testing. And that's really when you start doing that, chaos testing is basically your infrastructure level testing, even though you can use it for your application level testing. So when you start thinking cloud native, and we started moving into, we have like Kubernetes clusters in all different kinds of regions and in different cloud providers. We basically had to invent things to be able to be, oh, what happens if Azure goes down? Like you have to test that scenario. And like testing that at a infrastructure level is much different than testing it at an application level, because like application, you just make sure you can run an active or active passive. Where infrastructure, like how do I switch all the DNS over? How do I fail? How do I have that redundancy? And yanking it out is a much different process. Like you have to, you are the magic that makes it happen. Like you can't just, as an application developer, you could just rely on your infrastructure teams or your platform teams to make sure that like it's up and running somewhere else and that your service is capable of running multiple instances, where the infrastructure team has to make that magic happen.
Yeah. So that sounds challenging and exciting. So were you able to use kind of off the shelf tools for chaos testing to do these kind of things? Or are you have to create your own kind of tooling or framework to simulate these kind of situations?
So off the shelf tools really don't, when you get into it, especially at individual companies, especially slower moving companies, like mine's a financial institution, especially like banks and stuff like that, or even like Ford or like motor companies that are further behind on the tech tree. An off-shelf solution works great when you're greenfield. And one of the reasons, like when I go pick an off-the-shelf thing, I have to make sure it's as flexible and extensible as possible, because like I have to build all kinds of plugins or like weird adapters into them to really support testing. So like we have an orchestrator, and I basically built out little workers for that orchestrator. So like the orchestrator just orchestrates. It doesn't actually integrate directly with things. Like it can, but like I have to build out the adaption layer each time for that. And I use that. And we basically now have what's called a lift and shift process, where I can now go to any service and I can just run a workflow and it'll pick it up from one Kubernetes cluster and drop it in another, like perfectly seamlessly. And I built kind of chaos testing around that. So we basically now can perform an exercise on demand where we can lift and shift all of our applications from one cluster to another, kind of like in a Netflix mentality of like, I think they call it Chaos Kong, where they can just shut out whole regions. But that's not something like, I can't take Chaos Monkey off the shelf and it suddenly works. Like I can't just use Istio's out of the box, like chaos tools that it has in there. And even something like Lipness like I can't just like it's not very adaptable to what I need. I need something that's extensible. So like Test Cube is another one of the great tools because like I can put it where I need it to be, and then I could build out the containers and stuff that I can have my own custom like executors of tests to be able to test more of that fine grain infrastructure level detail as well as test the application stuff.
Mm. Okay, that's very cool. And I'm wondering if so people building applications for your infrastructure, do they have to do something or kind of be aware that you might be moving things between clusters, or is it totally transparent to the microservices or applications they're building?
Yeah. So we try to provide a platform so they pick an ideal place they want to be. So like say if they're using more Azure APIs, they're in Azure. If they say they're using more GCP APIs, they're in GCP. There's got to be closer to the SaaS services that their application utilizes, and that's the application arcs levels decision. But it's transparent where it's currently working out of. So like I could have it running out of somewhere else temporarily if I need to perform an upgrade. So like there's a bit of magic where they trust me to make sure that like it is going to be somewhere running. Is like this is their optimal spot of living, but I have degrees of freedom to move it around. And like I try to make sure and we try to collaborate and work together to make sure that the applications we build are as cloud native as possible because like obviously it's not a perfect world. You're not going to be 100% able to lift and shift something out of everywhere all the time. Like there's not going to be an equivalent to a specific technology somewhere else. I have to be aware of where those choke points are so that like I can like, oh, I picked this thing up, put it over here, and it explodes because it doesn't have access to a share drive on prem. And it's like, oh God. Yeah, I have to figure out like how do I make that thing accessible from anywhere? So like there's those kind of challenges as well. Yes, cloud native is like great and nice, but in reality, like especially again, financial companies, like our finance team wants things on a share drive in a particular spot. So we have to build adapters to make those things more portable, more resilient, and so that services interacting with those other like choke points, if they go down or need to move, they can. But that basically when like on-prem comes back up, everything comes back as normal. So like you got to kind of like build in like little bridges and adapters over to the cloud native world.
Wow. Okay. Fascinating. And is there? I'm guessing there could be different levels of how deep the contract is between the application and the infrastructure. So some things might be really easy to move around, and others are, to your point, very dependent on GPUs or whatever else.
Oh yeah, I love me a stateless application. A pure stateless like Kubernetes deployment, love that thing. It is the best behaved child on the planet. You can pick it up, move it. Like I absolutely love when I build workers for Conductor, like because it's kind of like a Kafka consumer. It just pulls out for work. It has no ingress into it. It doesn't do any of that. It operates off of a queue, and I can literally pick that thing up and yeet it wherever I want it, and it would basically keep resuming its work and it's fully independent. And then you get down the chain, it's like, oh, now it has a database and it has some kind of persistence in it, and it gets a bit harder. And then you have things like our Kafka clusters, like those things like require like you can't just lift and shift a Kafka cluster. You just build another cluster across the way and you have them sync. But then you're introducing now you have greater latency and greater distributed problems. Like you get the what is that called? Eventual consistency problems. So like you have to tell your teams is like, hey, when you're using this technology and it has to be across multiple regions and stuff, you now, especially for a financial institution, you have to deal with eventual consistency. And especially with like what we do, is like it has to be consistent. Like that is our number one thing. So you don't normally see a lot of things that are mission critical like on Kafka topics. It's going to be like sync APIs calls to things to ensure that like this happened and like I got the most up to date thing. So it's like maybe the application is running in multiple clusters, but the database where it is set up as active passive, and they're all going to one point to basically make sure that that consistency is met. So like, yeah.
Okay, very cool. And so how does I'm thinking like high level testing then in when if you want to do functional or load testing against your applications, do you move them to a special environment or infrastructure to run tests at scale or to kind of simulate certain behavior, et cetera, or is it kind of where they happen to be at the time of the execution of the tests, or what? Or I
Yeah,
mean, if you do run those
yeah.
tests, and
So for like load tests, we actually run them off hours in our lower environments. So everything that we have up in production, we have a staging and an integration layer
Mhm.
as well. Integration is for the devs as they like develop and merge in. That's for their first integration point where they're all together, all running together. And then staging we use for any kind of load testing, performance testing, like that kind of stuff. It's a more stable environment that gets released to less often. And that's kind of where we run that thing all together. We have started building out hermetic environments, but we're still in the process of that. So like we have thought of that, but how we do it today is that with TestCube, which was enabled us to do this with extensibility, is we have uh, runners in each of our 4 different locations. And basically, after we do a deploy, we have our orchestrator basically call out to TestCube, like it forks through each one of the environments and begins running tests from each of the environments so that we get numbers and performance metrics from each area traffic could be coming from. So like I need to know how long is this going to be from GCP to Azure? Like did that affect the performance? Because that's also a bit of testing for our infrastructure teams as well. Is like, hey, if Azure and GCP have a high latency, like what's going on there? Do we need to do something with that pipe? Is the VPN being weird? Is it hairpinning through on-prem and then over? Like, and then how's GCP talking to on-prem? How's Azure talking to on-prem and back and forth? So we try to run the tests out of many locations as we can to get a good idea of how the network's doing and make sure that like the performance doesn't super drop off the face of the earth when it's like running out of one of the environments. Because like, what happens
okay,
if I move there?
yeah.
Does that mean everything's going to go to hell in a handbasket because I moved it there?
Not a good thing. And you mentioned so there's an integration environment, a staging, and is there the promotion from from integration staging, is that automated, or do you like you run your functional integration test suite, and if that passes, you somehow promote, or how does that pipeline work?
So with all the microservices that we have basically created a self-deploy process. So every time a developer lands a commit on a service on
Mhm.
develop, it produces a new version. And then they have that option of deploying that version of code to whatever environment they want. It automatically goes to integration by itself. And then from there, they can basically promote it to stage or production whenever they would like, whenever their POs want, or whatever their release schedule is. So the dev teams have full control over that at the moment. We are moving towards a fully automated CD process where it's going to basically go to integration. It'll run our tests. It'll run our contract testing, and then it'll move on to the next environment, run the load test, run the things. So like that's currently in development right now, where we just basically took our one deployment workflow and copy pasted it 3 times and strung them together. So they will have full CD as an option later this year. So we are going to move towards a fully automated deploy to production model, but we have to mature our testing practices. We got to make sure they're all set up and ready to go because you don't want full straight to prod until you have your test suites in place and all that stuff.
Yeah, and definitely you want to. I mean, in that scenario, you want everything to be super 100% secure or well tested. Something we've discussed with previous episodes is kind of testing in production, and it's one of those things that usually people say it's something you shouldn't be doing, but they still do it as kind of that, not as the only way of testing, but as kind of a something that you do just on a hourly or daily schedule, just run your full integration test in your production environment just to make sure nothing slipped through the cracks. Is that something you do or have considered or have not, saying no, we'd never do that? What's your
Yeah.
take on that?
Well, we've actually had Google in house here for a minute, and we've been adopting an SRE practice with them, and they've been helping us guide us through that. And the SREs have actually provided a lot of light on like how to do that production testing. So like we've been able to figure out like, okay, you need to have some critical paths that you're testing and make sure that they're up. So like any status page that you make, like when you see like harnesses or any of those like larger vendors, they usually have a status page of like when I'm up. And like those statuses are usually their critical path. Like, can you log in? So they just have a bot that's constantly checking, can I get a test user to log in, get to a screen, and follow through a flow? So like we've been identifying critical user journeys through our applications and making sure that certain pages are up and running, certain actions work, and that kind of stuff. So that like if there is a deployment problem, it is caught immediately. And those things are not just running on a deployment, they're consistently there, so that we can actually make metrics on those things, make SLOs, and then eventually SLAs. So like when something does break, we have a level of service that we can provide and say that we'll be back up by X amount of time. So like we are moving in that direction, and it's been really fun to like come up with those things and make sure like, oh yeah, we're gonna have test cube every once in a while, like ping this certain endpoint to make sure it's up and running and getting a good result. We're gonna be doing like we're gonna be running a fake user through this little path through one of our like services to make sure that everything is working on that path, so that like if something does go wrong in the middle of the night, like someone gets alerted, someone gets woken up. So it's like testing in production is a little bit, you don't want to test as full extensively as you're doing in your loaders. You definitely don't want to be doing a load test in production. You're a madman if you try that. Absolutely mad. But you do want to have critical paths being regularly tested so that you're aware when something is not right. Otherwise, you're just flying by. Then you're waiting for a ticket to come in the queue to say like, "Oh, this is down." It's like you want to catch it, not the user.
I totally agree. I think got to be pragmatic. I guess there's a question: where do you draw the line just between monitoring and testing in production? Because I think a lot of monitoring tools also allow you to do a little bit more elaborate transactions, like user flows, etc. So, but definitely, I agree that having some kind of safety measure in place that just makes sure that your core user flows are there. I'm wondering who's in your team, or from your point of view, who's responsible for building and maintaining those tests? Is it the application team, or do you have a QA team, or is it on the ops team, or how does that work?
Well, it's like who's responsible for what part, and like there's some shared gray areas, but like so application tests, like unit tests, integration tests, load tests, those types of things are all going to be done by the app dev team. Like those are app level concerns that I couldn't guess at what is a critical user journey for you. There's no way in the world I see your app as a black box that I need to deploy. Like obviously I end up knowing more about it because like when shit goes wrong, I'm usually there. So it depends on what level you're at and what your concern is. So like we do have QAs and QEs. The QEs are mostly responsible for generating those automated tests. They're going to constantly be run, but some things like we have QAs for going in and doing smoke tests and stuff for that, like for things that we haven't automated yet. So, but if it's a single like applications concern, like, and it's at the application layer, it's going to be tested by the dev teams, and it's responsibility of the like DevOps team and the infrastructure team to be able to test their infrastructure changes. So like if I have a change control tonight and I need to go perform like upgrading a key portion of infrastructure, I need to know, oh, XYZ applications are there. So I need to reach out to those teams and be like, hey, what are some things that I can run to make sure that your app is fine after my change? So they know what their critical things are. They'll tell me, oh, you need to run XYZ suite to make sure that that change goes through properly. And then like I have my basic tests of like, oh, I can hit the thing, or like, yeah, DNS is resolving. Like I could do my base level tests.
So I mean, we've seen a lot from the test cube side on other customers is that specifically load testing is something that often falls on the responsibility of the ops team and not the application team, because they're responsible for the infrastructure. But I think you mentioned that load testing is still part of app dev. What's your take on that, or how would you split that responsibility?
So how we've exposed how they build applications is we have an IAC folder for them, and we give them levers to be able to scale up and down their application. So load testing is on them. So because they can tune how their app is deployed, how many instances there are, if it scales off a CPU. We've also given them like Kata scaler. So you could basically put inside your IAC folder that like, I need to scale off of this Kafka queue, and this, like that and the other. And then what I'm worried about is that just making sure that the cluster has the capacity to move in and out. But I can calculate what those numbers are because I have access to all of the services that are going to be deployed to those Kubernetes clusters. So I just got to make sure that the cluster has room to grow. And like if suddenly all the services on there spike, like there's room for it to get there. But I pass that to them because again, how do I know what to load test, like actually, like and what those numbers actually mean? Is like, oh, second response time for this thing, like to me that seems bad, but that might be expected, especially when I have like different teams. Like I have a document team. Document uploads and processing are long running processes in general, versus like I have teams that are like, oh, this is a just a calc engine, so I expect the number to go back in and out really fast. Like those are way different concerns of scaling. And if I go to an operations, if I go over to one of the server team members and ask them, was like, can you load test this thing? They're just going to look at me like deer in headlights. Like they don't know what they're looking at. They don't know if that's a good result. So really, you need to push those things onto the devs and give them the ability to tune those things.
It makes a lot of sense to give them the responsibility, but also then, to your point, the tools to set the required constraints so they can achieve the performance that they need. So that makes total sense. It sounds to me like you've come very far in your journey and of building, very mature cloud native testing, or just not testing, but just cloud native infrastructure. So is it? Would you think? I mean, one thing that often comes up in the context of testing and other things is kind of culture, and that being just as much of a challenge than as technology. How has it been for you? Is it been easy to get everyone on board? Is this is how we're going to do things, or has that been more of a discussion?
Yeah, so I've been at UWM for 5 years at this point. It has taken quite a long way to get here. Like 5 years ago, we didn't even have a Kubernetes cluster. It took 2 years to even get a Kubernetes cluster. And on top of that, it was every time it was proving the value each time around. And it was like we didn't get to the scope that we have today and having the 4 different environments like we do today, and being able to deploy to each of them like we do. It was like small steps. It was like one of the biggest steps that we took was basically building out a true platform of like, here's this thing, and I'm going to provide the dev teams with capabilities. I'm not providing all of those capabilities up front immediately. Here's the minimal viable product for you to start building microservices on. And then we started taking like, oh, you need to be able to tune this thing. Here's another capability. You need to be able to do automated tests. We grab test queue, put that on the stack. It's like kept adding capabilities and basically treating our platform like a product. Like if you've been to like KubeCon, that was one of the things they've been hammering. It basically treating it as like, okay, I really need to get like a base skeleton down and an automated way of deploying these services and standing them up so that like the dev teams basically have a vending machine for microservices. And then basically when they want a new candy bar in the vending machine, I need to add that candy bar then. But it was really getting that going. And then as soon as we got that up and running, like we started producing, like we're up to like 400 microservices over like 3 years.
Oh, wow.
Like
Okay.
it is really just a candy machine for them as they're converting older services into these microservices on these cloud native platforms. But like you have to build out that initial base, show that value, and then iteratively keep adding things to it. Like it didn't happen overnight. Like I said, I've been here for 5 years and it's taken that long to get to where we're at. And we still have plenty of room to grow. Like there's still so much more we can do. There's still tons of roadway.
And it's such a fast moving space still, right? So there's new things being introduced all the time. So I don't know, that can also be a challenge maybe, is how do you keep up, or how do you stay modern, or kind of and how relevant is that from the business point of view? I don't know if that's a core concern.
Oh yeah, it's a constant growing concern, which is why we brought in some more tools and stuff. So like we have Sneak and Sysdig, like we have all these other security tools that scan their repositories, make sure that like when there's vulnerabilities, they get updated. And then like on top of just the technology moves and how the Kubernetes API changes over time, is like a lot of the cloud vendors keep us on our toes because like they're on a 6-month time schedule for upgrading Kubernetes. So like having the engineering capacity and having the freedom to give, like particularly here, we give our engineers like Wednesday mornings, like the first half of their day, they're allowed to have lab time. So they're allowed to go research, stay up to date, go discover things on their own, figure that stuff out, and that really helps in like generating that. Basically, I'll have engineers and stuff coming over to me with new ideas, or they'll find a product somewhere and they'll be able to bring it in. Or we'll go out and do events like KubeCon. Like I really am a big advocate for get the hell out of the house, because like there's been some devs like their whole career has been here. They haven't seen what other infrastructures look like. They haven't talked to other engineers outside of here. It's like I need you to get some culture into the world. Get out to like a conference somewhere. Go to like anything, like go to a JavaScript conference, for God's sake, anything, like see the other parts of the stack. Don't just live on your team. Like we also do shadowing here. So like you're supposed to do like one shadow a month. So you go shadow another team, figure out what they do. Is like, so we really push that as well. So like you learning a more broad spectrum of things, so that like you get more ideas in your head. It's like, yeah, so we just have a nice culture here of like keeping people and wanting them to always self improve, which helps us always find those new things and keep up to date. So I actually have time built into my day to keep up to date, because like I can't imagine the nightmare. Like I used to be a front end developer, one of my previous lives, and like staying up to date on that stuff, it was like very fast. Like this is slow compared to like how like frameworks in the front end world change. Tooling goes right out the window and that stuff. I've dropped back into it for a little bit as we're like building out a new micro front end framework right now.
It's extremely fast moving.
It's extremely fast moving. So this is kind of snail's pace compared to that.
There you go. What's kind of you've alluded to a bunch of pipelines and how you're delivering. What's kind of the backbone? Are you building this on GitOps, Argo, or are you using multiple CI/CD tools, or more of an asynchronous approach? How are you kind of stringing everything together?
Yeah, so we have decoupled CI from CD. So like those are completely separate, because we have multiple ways of deploying. Because like we still have old infrastructure, we still have traditional VMs. Like those services are still here and around. So like we've decoupled those things. So we still use Jenkins for our main CI builds and orchestrating all that whole build process. So like anything that goes through there, we have a list of like I've made this monstrosity of a thing with the Jenkins shared library, where it loads up a library based on the pipeline you need, so that we could separate all the pipeline code, so that the teams that are responsible for maintaining those things can work on those, test those independently away from the app dev team. So like I can pull a service right now off into like a little testing environment and run a test pipeline off to the side and like modify it and make sure everything's good to go before I merge it in. And then the general population is now affected by that. So like we built out a whole thing just for that. So like we keep CI separate, and then CD based on what kind of pipeline you came from starts to display out. So like there'll be the standard Kubernetes deployments. So like if you're part of like a general population service for the floor, you're going to go through Harness. But if you're more infrastructure, like if you're base infrastructure, kind of like HashiCorp Vault or something like that, you're going to go through Argo. You're going to do an Argo deployment, because like you're going to be a little bit more control over that. You're going to have a more complex Helm chart. Like the developers aren't really diving into Helm charts. We just give them those levers and those capabilities, where the ops teams are going to be like, I need to like specifically tune the Helm chart. So we give them that access and allow them to have that greater freedom with Argo. So like we kind of tuned it to which place.
And how do you string together the CI to CD? Is that event driven, or is kind of does Jenkins push artifacts to some repository that then kicks off other deployment events, or how is that triggered?
Yeah, so we've been slowly building out. We use Orcus's conductor. It's like it's a Netflix like OSS project. So basically, when Jenkins is done, it kicks off a workflow in Orcus, and then that strings together all the other pieces. Or depending on the build, like it might just push the artifact in Artifactory, and then we have a developer portal for them to go to basically select what artifact they want deployed. So like it can be disconnected, it can also be connected. So like the infrastructure ones are connected and it will just kind of flow along, where the app dev ones are disconnected. So like in case of emergency, they can roll back to whatever version they need. Like they're a lot more flexible in what they get to do. But eventually there'll be full CD where it'll just be fully automated, and our greater orchestrator will coordinate all these different tools together to get this all done. I'm actually very close to replacing Jenkins with it. Very, very close. I'm like this close to having all the puzzle pieces needed to build my own Jenkins.
Okay, well, that sounds great. And finally, so when it comes to testing in CI, is there anything that like um, is that totally up to the individual app dev teams to decide on what they test or how they test before pushing their artifacts, or is there some consensus or guidelines, frameworks around that as well?
Yeah, so we have a couple of frameworks for them to use. So in CI, they're going to be running unit test level things, integration tests. So like those are your two options of running those things. And then you also have access to test containers to be able to run that type of stuff. And we've been trying to leverage a couple of different things to make the build and test not take an hour or sometimes. Like if it's more exhaustive tests, especially when you start getting into the realm of running integration tests with test containers and you're spinning up all that infrastructure around to get that more hermetic environment to basically rigorously test your app. We've been looking to like firing some of those off parallel to the jobs and regularly running those on the side. But we basically, the app dev team from their stuff is just testing their single service inside their code, or maybe just like half spun up with test containers around it, is what they have access to. In terms of testing the pipeline code itself, the DevOps teams have access to be able to override the code that is currently that's running the pipeline to point at a different branch and basically pull aside a service and basically independently test that off on its own like cadence and be able to like rigorously go through those tests, because it's a lot harder to test that because like you can't mock like bash scripts and like running certain CLIs and stuff like that. It's very hard to do that. So we more so just pull it off and treat it as a prototype service where it goes through basically as if it was a real service but never exposed live, and basically run a real service through your proposed changes.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Joe, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing all your insights. I'm super impressed by what you've built. It seems so mature and well thought out, and I, wish you all the best of luck with evolving that architecture. And hopefully, we'll be working together for some time going forward, and we can learn from you, and we can hopefully contribute to that with TestCube as well. Thanks to listeners. Joe, thanks again to you.
All right, it was a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.